The Duke walked the length of the cathedral and stopped the royal wedding 3 words into the vow. Then he looked at the bride's face and said, loud enough for every pew to hear, that she wore his dead wife's face for a reason no one in that room was ready to learn. 400 guests turned at once. Silk rustled like a single held breath, and the organ note that had been climbing toward the vow simply died in the pipes, leaving a silence so total that the bride could hear the candle flames moving. His name was Lucian Thornwell, the Duke of Ashmore, and he had not been seen in society for 3 years. He came down the long aisle in a black velvet tailcoat with antique gold braid, his dark near-black hair swept back, a faint old scar through his left eyebrow, storm gray eyes fixed on one face and nothing else. He did not hurry. A man who has buried everything he loved does not hurry. The bride at the altar was Cosima Vance, 23, in a gown of ivory and pearl, and she had never in her life seen the man now walking toward her as though she were a debt the world owed him. She was a vicar's ward with nothing, marrying a prince to save the people who had raised her. Her hands were cold. The bouquet shook. Beside her stood the groom, Prince Caspian, second son of the crown, golden and impatient. A man who collected beautiful things and married this one to spite a council that had told him no. He turned to the Duke with the easy contempt of a man who has never been refused. "You forget yourself, Ashmore." "I forget nothing," the Duke said. "That is my whole trouble." At the foot of the altar, a child sat very still in the front pew. Her name was Bess. She was 6 years old, and she was the Duke's daughter, the only living thing left to him after the fever took her mother. Bess had been told her mother was in heaven. She was looking at the bride now with her small face gone white, because the bride had her mother's mouth, her mother's chin, the exact tilt of her mother's head when she listened. "Mama," Bess said, not loud, but the cathedral carried it. Cosima heard the child and did not understand why the word landed in her chest like a fist. The Duke reached the altar rail. Up close, the resemblance was not a resemblance. It was a theft. The same auburn red hair in soft waves, the same green eyes, the same fair porcelain skin and full lips, the same small scar at the left temple that his wife had carried since girlhood. He had spent 3 years memorizing a face he could no longer touch, and here it was, breathing, terrified, wearing another man's ring. "Lenore," he said. The name came out of him like something pulled from a deep well. Lenore had been his duchess. Lenore had been dead 3 years. "My name is Cosima," the bride said. Her voice did not break, and the room marked that. "I have never met you, sir." "No," the Duke agreed. "You have not." He took from his coat a small black enamel locket on a worn chain and held it up so the candlelight caught it. Inside its open face was a painted miniature. A woman with auburn hair and green eyes smiling out of the past. "But you have met her. You meet her every time you look in a glass." The cathedral did not breathe. Cosima looked at the tiny painted face. She looked at it as a person looks over the edge of a high place, knowing she should step back and unable to. The woman in the locket was herself. Not similar. Herself, in a gown she had never owned, in a year before she could remember. "That is not possible," she whispered. "And yet," the Duke said quietly, "here we both are." Prince Caspian had heard enough. He stepped between them, golden and furious, and ordered the guards forward, and the cathedral broke at last into 400 voices. But over all of it, the Duke kept his storm gray eyes on Cosima. And Cosima, God help her, kept hers on him. Because in 3 years of being a girl no one wanted, No one had ever looked at her as though finding her mattered more than his own life. She did not marry the prince that day. To understand how a vicar's penniless ward came to be standing at the altar of a royal cathedral, you have to go back 6 weeks, to a parish on the cold edge of the Ashmore lands, where the rain came sideways off the sea and the people were poor and good and entirely without protection. Cosima Vance had been left at the vicarage door as an infant, wrapped in a blanket with no name pinned to it and no note, on a winter night when the Reverend Mr. Hale had nearly not heard the knock. She was raised on charity and scripture and the long patience of a childless old man and his wife. She learned to read by candle, to mend by feel, to be useful and quiet, and to expect nothing, because the orphan who expects nothing is never disappointed. She kept the church accounts by the time she was 12, because the Reverend's eyes had gone, and she had a head for figures that the village found unwomanly and the village debts found very convenient. What she could not learn to be was forgettable. She grew into a face that stopped market women mid-sentence. Strangers passing through would turn in their saddles. Once a peddler had gone gray and dropped his pack and crossed himself, and would not say why. Cosima had grown used to being looked at and learned to keep her eyes down, because a poor girl who is beautiful is not a fortune. She is a target. There was a young man in the parish, a fisherman's son, named Tam, who had loved her plainly since they were children, and who told her once, mending a net, that her face was a kind of weather that came over a room. She had laughed and told him to mind his knots, but she had remembered it, because no one else had ever made the beauty sound like a gift instead of a danger. That was the whole of romance in her life. A boy and a net and a sentence she kept. She did not expect more. The orphan who expects nothing. The trouble came the spring she turned 23, when the rains failed the planting and a hard man named Mr. Edmund Crail rode up the parish lane. Crail was a banker, 46 years old, well-fed, in a gray coat that cost more than the vicarage earned in a year. He held the mortgages on half the parish, including the church glebe itself, and he had ridden out to inform the Reverend Hale that the debts were called. The parish would be turned out by McElmus, and there was nothing in law that anyone could do. He said it the way such men say such things, softly, regretfully, with his eyes already counting the value of the pews. But Crail stopped speaking when Cosima came in from the garden with mud on her hands and the low sun behind her hair. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his careful face that she did not like. A quick private startle quickly mastered. The look of a man who has seen a ghost and decided in the same instant how to use it. And then, slow and oiled, he smiled and said there was perhaps a way the parish might be spared after all. Cosima felt the smile land on her like a hand. She did not yet know what it meant. She knew only that she had been seen and counted, and that men who counted her were never kind. Crail's way of sparing the parish was this, that Cosima would go to the capital and let herself be presented at court. He did not say why. He said only that a face like hers was an asset, that a great gentleman of his acquaintance was in want of a beautiful, friendless, untraceable young woman of no family, and that the gentleman would pay the parish's debts in full and clear the church of every farthing it owed. All Cosima had to do was go, and be agreeable, and ask no questions. The Reverend Hale refused. He stood up in his threadbare coat and told the banker to leave his house, and Crail only shrugged and said the eviction would proceed, and that the old man might explain to 40 families why their roofs were taken when a single trip to the city would have saved them all. Then he set a folded paper on the table, the writ of eviction, already drawn. already sealed, and he said he would return for an answer in 3 days, and he rode back down the lane without once looking behind him. Cosima lay awake that night and listened to the rain and counted the families, as she counted everything. The Pelus with the new baby, Widow Ash, who was 80, the blacksmith's 6 children, 40 roofs, 1 trip. She turned the arithmetic over and over, and it always came out the same honest arithmetic does, whether you like the answer or not. By morning, she had decided. She told the Reverend she would go. She lied and said she was not afraid. She packed 1 small bag and tucked into the lining of it the only thing she owned from before the vicarage, the blanket she had been left in, with a single faded letter embroidered in the corner. An L. She had never known what it stood for. As a child, she had decided it was the first letter of her true name, the one her mother had meant to give her, and she had carried that small story all her life as other children carry a charm. Tam met her at the crossroads in the gray before dawn to say goodbye. He did not ask her not to go. He had known her too long for that. He pressed a smooth gray stone into her hand, a thing they had found together as children and called lucky, and he said, "Come back, Cosima," and she said she would, and both of them knew, without either one saying it, that she would not. She kept the stone. She did not keep the boy. That is the shape of a life that begins at a door with no name on it. She did not know, climbing into Krail's hired coach, that the gentleman in want of her was a prince. She did not know that the prince had seen a portrait Krail had commissioned of her in secret, sitting for which she had been told was a charity sketch for the parish almanac, and had said, looking at it, that he must have the woman in the painting, that there was something in the face he could not name and would not be denied. She did not know that the portrait had passed, by ill luck or design, across other eyes first, the eyes of a duke in mourning, who had taken one look at it in a dealer's window on the capital's quiet north side and gone so still that the dealer feared he had taken ill, and who had bought it without haggling and carried it home and not slept. So Cosima came to the capital. She was lodged in a fine house and fitted for fine clothes and taught, in a fortnight, which fork and which curtsy, and told nothing. The prince came to look at her twice, as a man looks at a horse before a race, pleased and incurious. The Countess Drusilla Pike, his aunt, ran the whole arrangement with a voice like a closing drawer and eyes that went over Cosima's face with a flicker of something cold, as though even she half felt that this was no ordinary purchase. And on the appointed morning, Cosima Vance was dressed in ivory and pearl and driven to a royal cathedral to be married to a prince she had spoken to 4 times, to save 40 roofs 3 hours to the north. And a man who had buried his wife 3 years before walked the length of that cathedral to stop it. In the vestry behind the altar, with the cathedral in uproar beyond the door, Cosima found herself alone with the Duke for the space of a few minutes, and those minutes changed everything that came after. He set the locket on the table between them, open, the painted face turned up. "Pick it up," he said. "I will not touch you. Pick it up yourself." She picked it up. Her own face looked back at her from 20-odd years ago, in oils, smiling. She felt the floor of her life tilt. Her name was Lenore, the Duke said. She was my wife. She died of the spotted fever 3 springs past, in my own bed. He said it flatly, the way men say the things that have worn smooth from handling. I buried her under the chapel floor at Ashmore, where I could stand on the stone. And then 6 weeks ago I saw this same face in a dealer's window. The dead, alive again. Sold to a prince like a mare at a fair. "I am not your wife," Cosima said. "I cannot be. I do not remember you. I do not remember any of this. I know. And then, more quietly, the words seeming to cost him, that is what frightens me. A fraud I could have arrested. But you are afraid in the right way. You flinch at the right things. You hold your head as she held hers, and you do not know that you are doing it. He looked at her as a man looks at a problem he cannot solve and cannot stop solving. Who were your parents? I have none. I was left at a door. Where? A parish on the Ashmore coast. 23 years ago. In winter. Something passed over the Duke's face then, a fast, sharp recalculation, the look of a man who has heard the first crack of ice he is standing on. 23 years, he repeated. On the Ashmore coast. He did not finish the thought aloud, but he picked up the locket and closed it and held it in his fist, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. You will not marry the prince. Come to Ashmore, not as my wife, never as my wife, as my guest, until I understand what was done to us both. His jaw tightened. And it was done, Cosima. Someone did this. Faces like ours are not an accident of God. They are an arrangement of men. She should have said no. A wise girl would have run from a grieving duke and his dead wife's face. But Bess was standing in the vestry doorway by then, 6 years old, looking up at her with her own green eyes, and the child crossed the floor and took Cosima's hand and would not let go. And Cosima, who had been left at a door, who had never belonged to a single living soul, felt the small fingers close around hers, and could not, in the end, make herself pull away. The prince fought it. Naturally, there was a great deal of noise and a threat of law, and the Countess Drusilla Pike declared loudly in the nave that the Duke of Ashmore had run mad with grief and ought to be confined. But the Duke held a higher rank than a second son's aunt. He held the truth of the portrait's provenance, and he held, above all, the unbearable public fact of 2 identical faces in one room that no amount of breeding could explain away. The prince let her go rather than be made a circus. He let her go the way Caspian let go of everything that stopped amusing him, with a shrug and a long cold look at the Duke that promised this was not finished. It was not finished. Cosima went to Ashmore. Ashmore Hall stood 3 hours from the capital on a headland over a gray sea. A great cold house of black stone and tall windows, and it had not been a happy house in 3 years. The servants had gone quiet, as servants do where grief lives. They had loved the late Duchess. And when Cosima stepped down from the carriage into the courtyard, every one of them stopped what they were doing and stared, and an old laundrywoman dropped a basket of linen into the mud and said, before she could stop herself, "She's come back." "She has not come back," the Duke said sharply, and the courtyard scattered. But the word stayed. Through that whole first week the house could not decide whether Cosima was a miracle or a haunting, and treated her as people treat a thing they are afraid to love and afraid to lose twice. A maid left a posy of snowdrops at her door and would not own to it. A groom crossed himself when she passed the stable. The cook made, the first night, the late Duchess's favorite dish, and then wept into the pastry and had to be sent home. If you have stayed with this story even this far, if a tale about an overlooked girl, the orphan, the charity ward, the one the whole world counted and dismissed, finally being seen by the one man who could not look away is the kind of story you came here for tonight, then take one moment and subscribe, because that is the only kind of love story this channel tells. The plain one, the bought one, the nameless one at the door, chosen at last for herself. The people who subscribe are the ones this whole channel is for, And the secret Cosima is about to uncover is the reason every story here exists. Stay with me. Because the house had one person in it who had not lost her head, and what she found behind Cosima's ear changed all of it. Her name was Maud Pinner, 50 years old, square and plain and entirely without nonsense, the kind of woman who has buried a husband and 3 of her own and is done being frightened by anything that walks on 2 legs. Mrs. Pinner had served the family 40 years. She had laid out the late Duchess for burial with her own hands, and on the second night, while she turned down the bed in the green guest room, she looked at Cosima for a long, level moment. And then she sat down rather suddenly on the edge of the chair, as though her legs had gone. "Forgive me, miss," she said. "I knew the Duchess as a girl. I dressed her for her own wedding. Her plain face was working. There is a thing on you that was on her. May I?" And she lifted, gently, the auburn waves from the left side of Cosima's neck and went still. There behind the ear was a small crescent birthmark, pale brown, the shape of a new moon. "My lady had its twin, Mrs." Pinner whispered, "on the other side. The right. I powdered over it on her wedding morning so the lace would lie clean." She let the hair fall and covered her mouth with her apron and would say no more that night. Cosima lay awake again, as she had on the night the banker came, and pressed her fingers to the small moon behind her ear, and thought about mirrors, a thing on the left of one woman and the right of the other. That was not a likeness. A likeness does not flip. Only one thing in nature flips a mark from one side to its other. A reflection. Or a twin. She did not let herself think the second word. Not yet. The days at Ashmore settled into a strange and careful peace. The Duke kept his distance. He had promised never to treat her as his wife, and he kept the promise like a man holding a door shut against a storm. But the house was small in the ways that matter, and they could not help crossing in it. He found her in the library, reading his late wife's books, and stopped in the doorway, and the look on his face was so naked that he turned and left without a word. She found him in the chapel at night, his hand flat on the cold floor stone with Lenore cut into it, and she did not disturb him. But she stood in the dark a long while watching a man grieve a woman who wore her own face, and something in her ached that she had no name for and did not want one. There were small collisions that neither of them planned. A morning she came down early and found him already at breakfast, and he looked up, and for half a second his face simply opened. Glad, before memory closed it again, and she saw the gladness and the closing both, and felt the cost of it. She learned, in that first fortnight, to announce herself before she entered a room, a hand on the door frame, a word in the corridor, because the sight of her face appearing without warning could stop the breath in his chest, and she would not be the instrument of that small daily cruelty if she could help it. It was a strange courtesy, to soften your own face for a man's sake. She did it without being asked, and he noticed that she did it, and never named it, and was grateful past saying. Once, crossing the upper gallery at dusk, she passed a tall mirror in a gilt frame and stopped dead, because for half a heartbeat she had thought a portrait of the dead Duchess hung where the glass was, and then understood it was only herself, and stood looking at the strangeness of being her own ghost. The Duke found her there. He did not speak. He came and stood a little behind her, and for a long moment they both looked at her reflection in the dim gold-edged glass, the living woman and the man who had buried her face, and neither of them said the dead one's name, and there was a kind of peace in the not saying, a truce in the long, quiet war they were each fighting alone. An evening he handed her a book across the library table, and their fingers met on the spine, and they both went still, and the candle guttered, and he drew his hand back first and said, "Lo, forgive me." though she had not asked him to. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid of himself, of the ease with which his heart tried to walk an old road to a new woman, and Cosima understood it, because she felt the same road under her own feet and would not walk it either. Not while it was a dead woman's road. It was the accounts that first put them on the same side of a table. The Duke had pulled, from a locked press, the old estate ledgers of Lenore's family, the books Krail had kept, meaning to read them himself for some proof of the second child, and he had given up by the second page, because numbers swam before him and always had. He found Cosima at the library table one night and set the great cracked book down in front of her, almost in apology. "I cannot read these," he said. "I never could." Lenore could not either. We trusted the man who kept them, because trusting was easier than learning. He looked at the ledger as a man looks at a closed door he has walked past for years. "Will you?" She drew the candle close and opened the book, and bent her head, and went quiet in the particular quiet of a person doing the one thing she was made to do. The Duke watched her finger move down a column and stop, and move and stop, and he saw something he had not seen on that face in 3 years. Not grief, not fear, but absorption. A mind wholly and happily at work. "Here," she said at last, soft, "a farm sold in the spring of the year I was born. And here, 2 years on, the same farm paying rent to the estate as though it had never been sold at all. A man cannot rent what he has already sold, unless the selling was a lie, or the renting is." She did not look up. Whoever kept these books was not careless. He was bold. Careless men leave gaps. Bold men leave a story, and forget that a story can be read backward. The Duke sat down across from her, slowly, and for a long while he said nothing, only watched her work, the small frown, the lips moving over the figures, the candlelight on the auburn hair, so like and so unlike. He had married a woman with this face who could not have told a rent from a wager and had never wanted to. The one in front of him had been counting a parish's debts since she was a child, by need, by nature, and she leaned into the cruel columns as though they were a riddle set for her pleasure. He had thought the face was the whole of the likeness. He was learning, line by line of an old ledger, how little a face was. "You should sleep," he said, "near 2 in the morning." In a moment, Cosima said, not looking up, already 3 lines deeper, and he did not press her, because he understood, suddenly and completely, that he was watching a woman come home to herself, and that he would have sat there until dawn rather than be the one to call her away from it. The child was the bridge. Bess attached herself to Cosima with the fierce, uncomplicated love of a motherless 6-year-old handed back the impossible. She brought Cosima drawings of horses with too many legs. She fell asleep against Cosima's side over a book of fables. She called her, once, by accident, Mama, and then went white and clapped both hands over her mouth. And Cosima gathered the small, shaking shoulders and said, "You may call me Cosima, and we shall be friends, and that is its own true thing." The child cried and was comforted. The Duke, watching from the gallery above, gripped the rail until his knuckles went pale, because he had wanted for 3 years to give his daughter exactly that and had not been able. And here it was being given by a stranger with his wife's hands. He came to her that night in the library, and for the first time he spoke not as a man defending a wound, but as a man asking for help. "I have written to your parish," he said, "to the Reverend Hale. I asked for the exact night you were left, the year, the hour, any mark or token." He set the locket on the table between them, his constant habit now, as another man sets down a glass. "And I have written to the household where my wife was born, and to the registry of the coast." because one child was born to that old family the winter you were left. The record says one. A daughter. Lenore, he looked at her steadily. But a laundry woman who served that house swears to this day there were 2 cries in the lying-in room that night, 2, and was told before God that she had dreamed the second. 2, Cosima said. 2, and one was given to a door. She took up the blanket she had carried all the way from the vicarage, the only thing from before, and laid it beside the locket and turned back the corner where the single faded letter was stitched. An L. The Duke looked at the L for a long time. Then he opened the locket, and on the inside of its little hinged lid, almost worn away, was an engraver's monogram so small it could be read only by candle. 2 letters, intertwined, an L, and beneath it, fainter, as though added later by a different hand, a second initial the years had nearly eaten, but not quite. A CL for Lenore, the Duke said softly, and C for don't, Cosima said. She was shaking. Don't say it. If you say it and it is not true, I think I shall die of it. But the letters sat on the table in the candlelight, L and C, the embroidered and the engraved, 2 halves of a thing broken 23 years before, and neither of them could pretend any longer not to see it. She was not Lenore returned. She had never been a ghost, or a fraud, or a clever girl in paint. She was Lenore's twin, born the same winter night in the same lying-in room to the same dying mother. One daughter kept, named, raised to be a duchess. One daughter carried out into the dark and left at a vicarage door with a blanket and a single stitched letter, so that one estate would have one clean heir, and one inconvenient second girl would simply, conveniently, cease to exist. Someone had done it. The Duke had said it in the vestry, and he had been right. Faces like theirs were an arrangement of men, and the man who had ridden up the parish lane to sell that face to a prince was the same man who had stood, 23 years before, as the family's young agent of business, the cold, careful, well-fed keeper of the family's accounts and secrets. Mr. Edmund Crail. It took the rest of the winter to prove it, and the proving nearly cost them both their lives, and I will tell you exactly how. But first you should understand what Crail stood to lose, because a man does not carry a newborn girl out into the snow for nothing. The old family, Lenore's family, and so Cosima's, had been one of the great houses of the coast. When their mother died in childbed, and their father within the year, the whole of that fortune fell to a single legitimate heir, to Lenore. And Crail, the young agent, had been made executor. Trusted, unwatched, holding the books. He had spent 23 years quietly hollowing the estate from inside, selling off the outlying farms under forged authority, lending the family's own money back to the family's own tenants at ruinous interest, entering false rents and pocketing the true ones, building a banker's fortune on a dead family's bones. It had all rested on one thing: that there be only one heir, that the estate pass cleanly, without question, to a woman who trusted him and asked nothing. But Lenore had married the Duke of Ashmore, and a duke's lawyers ask questions. When Lenore died of the fever, Crail's 20-year theft had stood one careful inquiry away from the gallows, saved only by grief, by a widowed duke who could not bear to open his dead wife's accounts and let them lie shut. Crail had breathed again. Crail had believed himself safe. And then a second face had walked out of the past. A face that, if anyone ever traced it, would prove there had always been a second heir, a second claim, a second set of eyes that might one day open his books. He could not have her quietly killed, A beautiful, penniless girl who simply vanishes, makes talk on a small coast. But a beautiful, penniless girl married off to a foreign-bound prince and carried abroad to a distant court. That girl disappears into a palace and is never seen on the Ashmore lands again. That was the arrangement. That was why the secret portrait. That was why the prince. The Duke had wrecked it in 3 words at an altar, and Crail, who had spent his life among men who shrug and walk away, did not shrug. He came north. He came under the law's own colors, which was the cruel cleverness of him. He arrived at Ashmore Hall with a writ and a magistrate and the Countess Drusilla Pike at his side, and he stood in the great cold entrance hall and declared, in his soft, regretful voice, that the woman calling herself Cosima Vance was an impostor, a parish drab trained up to mimic a dead duchess, slipped into a grieving duke's house to work upon his madness and steal the Ashmore name and fortune. He had documents. He had the Countess, who swore to the magistrate that she had watched the Duke run mad with grief in the cathedral before 400 souls. He had the prince's wounded pride behind him like a following wind, and he asked the magistrate, reasonably, regretfully, to remove the impostor and place the grief-broken Duke under the protection of his nearest relations, relations who would, of course, see the estate's accounts properly kept. It was very nearly perfect. It very nearly worked. The magistrate was an honest, frightened man, and the documents were good. Crail forged documents as other men breathed, and the law has never been tender toward penniless girls with no name and a borrowed face. They nearly lost it there. There was a night, 2 days before the magistrate's hearing, when a fire broke out in the muniment room where the Duke had begun to gather his proofs, and only Mrs. Pinner's nose for smoke and her bucket of sand saved the half of the papers that survived. No one ever proved who said it. No one needed to. Cosima sat up the rest of that night with the scorched documents spread on the floor, drying them sheet by sheet, reading ledgers by the same candle she had once read scripture by, because she had kept a parish's books since she was 12, and she could follow a lie through a column of figures the way a hound follows a scent through gorse. And somewhere near dawn, in a ledger Crail had forged, she found the thread that hanged him. A quarter's rents entered in an ink that smelled, even now, faintly of iron and bramble, an ink, the Duke's lawyer would later swear, that no maker in the kingdom had sold until 2 full years after the date written above it. A man may forge a hand. He cannot forge the year a thing was made. But Crail was not finished, and the night before the hearing he reached for the one thing in that house worth more than any ledger. Bess, she had wandered out at dusk to the cliff path to look for the gulls, as she did most evenings, and she had not come back when the dark came down, and when Cosima went to fetch her in for supper, the path was empty and the cold was coming up off the sea in a wall. They found the child's shoe at the cliff edge, and for one black moment the whole household stood frozen at the drop, looking down at the rocks and the gray water working over them, and Cosima heard the Duke make a sound she had never heard a man make. But Bess was not in the water. A stranger had been seen on the headland that afternoon, a gray-coated man asking the way to the hall, and the child was found an hour later. Cold and frightened but whole, shut into the old ice house at the bottom of the kitchen garden, where someone had carried her and left her, the bolt thrown, a clear message and a clear threat: withdraw, let the impostor go, or the next time the child is not found. Cosima reached her first. She had remembered in the search that Bess feared the dark above all things, and had thought where she herself would hide a frightened child to break a parent's nerve, and had run to the ice house on instinct and wrenched the bolt and gone down into the cold dark on her knees, and the little girl flew into her arms and held on as though to a spar in a wreck. I called for Mama, Bess sobbed into her neck. I called and called. I came, Cosima said. I will always come. And she meant it past all reason. This orphan who had belonged to no one, holding a child who was not hers, on the floor of a cold, dark room. And she understood in that moment that she was already past leaving. They could threaten her with anything but this child, and they had chosen this child, and so they had lost. Because a woman with nothing to protect can be frightened off, and a woman who has finally found something to protect cannot. The Duke came down the ice house steps and knelt and put his arms around them both, the child between them, and the three of them stayed there a moment in the dark, and no one said anything, because there are things a fright like that says for you. When he lifted his daughter and carried her up into the light, he looked at Cosima over the small head, and what was in his face was no longer grief, and no longer fear, and no longer the old road to a dead woman. It was a new thing entirely, and it frightened him more than the cliff had, and he did not look away from it. The next morning, Cosima walked into the hearing with her chin level and her hands steady, and she was not afraid of Edmund Crale anymore, because a man who would lock a child in the cold to win has already shown you the size of his soul, and there is nothing left in him to dread. But it was Mrs. Pinner who broke the hearing open. When the magistrate sat in the great hall, and Crale laid out his papers and the Countess swore her oath, the housekeeper walked in from the back in her gray dress, with her own honest account books under her arm, and set them on the table with a crack. Begging the magistrate's pardon, she said, but I have served this family 40 years, and I laid out my lady for her grave, and I shall say a thing here, whether his lordship wishes it or no. She turned and looked at Edmund Crale, and her plain square face did not flinch. On the night my lady was born, I was a girl carrying linen in that lying-in room. I heard 2 children cry, 2, her voice did not rise, and the only other soul in that corridor was the young man of business, that man, holding a bundle, going out the servant's door into the snow. She set her jaw. I held my tongue 40 years because I was told I dreamed it, and because the man who told me so held my wages and my place. I will not hold it another hour. Crale's face did not change, but his hand, resting on the writ, went white at the knuckle. It was not yet proof. A magistrate cannot hang a banker on a housekeeper's 40-year-old memory. But it was a crack, and the Duke had been waiting all winter for a crack, and into it he drove everything he had gathered. The midwife's daughter, found at last in a coastal almshouse, who remembered her mother weeping over a second child she had been paid to forget the existence of. The registry clerk, who confessed under the magistrate's eye that he had been bribed to enter 1 berth where there should have been 2. The forged ink, with its impossible date. And the blanket. The plain parish blanket with its single-stitched letter. The L that had puzzled Cosima all her life, which Mrs. Pinner now took up in her hands and turned over, and traced with her thumb, and finished. Because the stitching did not end at the L. The thread went on, faded, nearly invisible, the start of a word. Not an L standing alone. The first letter of lost. The mother, dying, had stitched it herself into the blanket of the daughter she could not keep. She had named the truth into the cloth with her last strength, that this second girl was being taken from her, lost, carried into the dark, and had sent her into the world marked, so that one day, if there were any justice under heaven, the mark might be read by someone with eyes to read it. The entrance hall of Ashmore Hall was very quiet. It was the locket that finished it. The Duke took it out one final time, the black enamel locket that had hung at his heart for 3 years, and he did the thing he had never done in all that time. He worked the point of a small knife behind the painted miniature. Because Mrs. Pinner had remembered, of a sudden, her old mistress once speaking of a locket with a little room behind the picture. The backplate gave. Behind the portrait of Lenore was a second hollow, and folded in it to the size of a thumbnail was a square of paper gone brown with age. A baptismal record. 2 names in a dying woman's hand. Lenore and Cosima. Twin daughters, one cloth, one blood, born the same hour to the same mother, set down by the one person no forger had thought to silence, who had hidden the proof inside a child's keepsake, and died before she could tell a living soul where she had put it. Cosima Vance was no impostor. She was the lost second daughter of the house, the rightful joint heir to everything Edmund Crail had spent his life stealing. And the paper folded in the locket said so in her own mother's hand. The magistrate read it 3 times. Then he turned to Edmund Crail, very quietly, and asked him to explain the ink. Crail did not explain the ink. Men like Crail never do, in the end. He looked once around the cold great hall at the faces all turned to him, and the smooth, oiled certainty went out of him like water from a cracked jug. He did not rage. He did not run. He set the forged writ down on the table beside the housekeeper's honest books, very gently, as a man sets down a thing he has finally understood is worthless. And he let the magistrate's men take his arms, and he walked out of Ashmore Hall into the same snow he had once carried a newborn through. The door closed behind him. That was all. The Countess Drusilla Pike had already gone. She had slipped out the moment the locket opened, gathering her skirts, and her carriage was on the south road before the writ touched the table. No one stopped her. No one at Ashmore ever heard her speak of the place again. The prince did not come north. Princes do not ride out for women who have stopped being convenient. Caspian married a duke's daughter within the year and forgot, with the ease of a man who has never once wanted a thing he could not buy twice over, that he had ever stood at an altar and been refused. And the Duke of Ashmore was left in his cold great house with his daughter, and his housekeeper, and a woman who wore the face of the wife he had buried, but who was not his wife, had never been his wife, and could not, by the plain shape of the thing, ever simply step into the empty place that face had left. This is the part people get wrong about love and grief, and I want to ask you something before the end, because I have turned it over myself and never settled it. When you have buried the one face you loved, and the world hands that same face back to you fixed to a different soul, is it a cruelty or is it a mercy? Would you have stayed in that house and learned the new heart behind the old face? Or would you have run from a ghost who was not a ghost? Tell me below. I read them. I read every one of them, and I want to know where you would have stood in that cold hall. Because Cosima did not become Lenore, and that was the whole of it. That was the thing the Duke had been most afraid of, that he would let himself love the sister for the dead one's face, and so love a memory, and so insult the living woman by never once seeing her at all. He would not do it. He made himself learn the differences instead of the sameness, like a man learning a language he is ashamed to have assumed he already spoke. Cosima laughed at things Lenore had found foolish. Cosima could not carry a tune across a room and did not care who heard her fail. Cosima read the dull books, the law, the ledgers, the very accounts that Lenore had trusted blindly and that had cost the family everything, read them late into the night with her finger moving down the figures, because she had been raised by a poor honest man to count the true cost of things. and she would never again let an estate go unwatched in the dark. They were not the same woman. They had only ever shared a face and a winter and a mother. And the Duke came slowly across a long gray winter and a greening spring to love the woman in front of him for every single way she was not the woman beneath the chapel stone. That, and only that, was a love that would not have been a haunting. He told her so on an evening in early summer, on the headland above the sea, with Bess running ahead of them on the cliff path and the gulls turning gold in the low light. He did not kneel. He was not a kneeling sort of man. He took the black enamel locket from around his own neck, the locket he had worn against his heart for 3 years, and he opened it, and he lifted out the painted miniature of Lenore, with great care, and he laid it into Cosima's hand. "Keep her," he said. "She was your sister. You have more right to her face than I ever had." And then his storm-gray eyes came up and held hers at last, with nothing in them now of the dead. "I am asking the woman who reads my ledgers and cannot sing, not the one in the picture. Will you stay?" She looked down at the small painted face of the sister she had never met, the twin who had been kept while she was carried into the snow, who had worn silk while she wore charity wool, who had died young in this man's arms while she was learning to mend by feel in a parish on the coast. 2 halves of one winter night, 23 years apart, come back at last to the same headland over the same gray sea. She closed her hand around the miniature. She did not hand the locket back. "I will stay," Cosima said, "but not as her. As myself, or not at all." "As yourself," the Duke said. "I would not have you any other way. I learned that lesson once. Too late. I will not learn it twice." They were married in the chapel at Ashmore, over the stone with Lenore cut into it, and Cosima stood on her sister's grave to take her vows and did not find it strange, because the dead woman had given her a face and a name and a way home, and there was no grief in standing there, only a kind of quiet thanks. Mrs. Pinner cried and pretended she had something in her eye. Bess scattered the petals and dropped most of them, and was forgiven before she had finished apologizing. The Reverend Hale came up from the coast in his mended coat to give the bride away, and the parish he had saved by sending her into the dark sent 40 families worth of small good things, a jar of honey, a worked handkerchief, a basket of the first eggs, because the girl they had raised on charity had not forgotten a single one of them, and never would. Tam the fisherman's son sent the smooth gray stone back to her, wrapped in a scrap of net with no note, and she understood it, and she set it on the chapel sill where the morning light would find it, and she let the boy go gently, as you let go of a thing that loved you well in a smaller life. The estate Edmund Crail had spent his life hollowing was slowly, carefully made whole. Cosima did the making. She had the books open every quarter day on the great table where the housekeeper had once cracked down her honest ledgers, and she went line by line, in her own steady hand, in good plain ink, and the tenants who had been bled for 23 years had their rents set right and their forged debts struck out, and the outlying farms bought slowly back from the men Crail had sold them to. Widow Ash and the Pellews and the blacksmith's 6 children, 3 hours south, never knew that the woman keeping books they would never see had once lain awake, counting their roofs in the dark, and decided that night to be brave. And the locket. The black enamel locket that had begun it all, hanging in a dealer's window where a grieving duke went still as stone. The locket lived now on Cosima's own neck, the painted sister inside it, the brown baptismal paper folded back into its hidden room where the mother had left it. Twice each year, on 2 winter dates that fell within a week of each other, Cosima took it out and opened it, and held the small face to the candle. One date for the sister who had died in the spring she was 23. One date for the night the two of them had been born and broken apart and sent down two such different roads to the same cold, beautiful house above the sea. The house grew warm again, slowly, as a cold house always does once there are children's drawings on the walls and books left open on tables. Bess learned to sleep through the night. Mrs. Pinner, who had been done being frightened, allowed herself at last to be glad, and her gladness came out as fierce small kindnesses. A warming pan slipped into a bed, a favorite cake left covered on a sill. The Reverend Hale wrote from the coast every month in his shaking hand to say the parish roofs held, that Widow Ash had seen another spring, that the Pellews baby was walking, and Cosima kept all the letters in a drawer beneath the ledgers, the saved and the savers together, and answered every one. On an evening late in that first married autumn, the light going copper over the headland, the Duke found his wife in the chapel, standing on the cold stone with her hand flat against it, where he himself had stood 1,000 nights. Bess was asleep upstairs. Mrs. Pinner was humming in the kitchen below. The sea went on with its old gray work beyond the windows. Cosima was 23 years old, the same age her sister had been when the fever took her, and she stood on her twin's grave with the black enamel locket warm in her closed hand, and she was not weeping, and she was not afraid. The Duke crossed the dark chapel and stood beside her and did not speak. After a while she opened her hand and showed him the locket, the painted face catching the last of the light, and the two of them looked down together at the stone, with the one name cut into it, and then up, through the tall window, at the first star coming out over the sea. She brought me home, Cosima said quietly, the only way she could. The Duke breathed out, slow and steady, the breath of a man who has finally set down a thing he carried too long. She did, he said, and he closed his hand over hers, over the warm locket, over the small moon behind her ear that was the mirror of a moon now under the stone, and they stood together in the falling dark and let the long day go. The dead do not come back, but sometimes the living are sent to finish what the dead could not say.